So imagine for a second that you order a brand new top-of-the-line smartphone.
Right, like the newest model.
Exactly. You flip the button, and a few days later, this pristine little box arrives at your front door.
It's a great feeling.
Yeah, it's sleek, it's shiny, it's exactly what you wanted. But then the very next morning, a massive industrial dump truck just backs up onto your front lawn.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, it just unloads tons of broken rock, chemical runoff, like diesel-soaked dirt, right onto your grass.
Just right there on the lawn.
Right there. And the driver just leans out the window and says, hey, thanks for your purchase. This is just the waste generated from mining the zinc and lead for your phone. You keep this part.
I mean, that is quite an image.
But the thing is, most of us never see that dump truck, right? We just get the pristine box.
We're completely insulated from it.
But if you look at the source material we're digging into today, we've got this dossier called the Uncosted West, along with EPA data, federal fishery rulings, and some really powerful tribal testimony. That truck is backing up every single day in Alaska.
It really is.
And it's leaving the cost of our modern world right on the doorsteps of the people who actually live there.
Yeah, it's a striking analogy, and it perfectly captures, the fundamental dynamic we are dissecting today in this deep dive.
Right.
We are looking at a system where the financial gains are highly mobile, they move around the world, they're entirely privatized. But the physical losses, those are completely stationary.
And socialized.
Exactly, socialized.
Okay, so let's unpack this. The overarching theme that really connects all of our sources today is this concept of the export colony.
Right, the export colony.
And our mission for this deep dive is to adopt a really measured, documentary, humane sort of tone to explore how a frontier operates under this specific model.
Because it's a very specific economic setup.
It is. It's a place where minerals and protein are extracted and shipped out for profit, while the people living there, they absorb the pollution and the loss.
Yeah.
But okay, let me play devil's advocate for a second here.
Go for it.
So a region has a natural resource, an outside company brings in the capital to extract it, and local people get jobs. I mean, isn't that just basic textbook capitalism? Why use a loaded term like colony?
Well, that is the essential counter-argument, right?
Yeah.
But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the distinction really lies in the structural permanence of the extraction.
What do you mean by that?
So in a standard circular capitalist economy, wealth circulates locally.
Okay.
A factory pays its workers, those workers buy groceries at a local store, and that store pays local farmers. The money stays in the ecosystem.
Bounces around the community.
Right. But an export colony, historically and economically, is different. It treats this vast, resource-rich geography basically as a warehouse.
Just a place to take things from.
Exactly. The physical flow of the valuable goods, the actual wealth, moves permanently outward to distant markets. It never circulates locally.
Wow. Okay.
Meanwhile, the stationary accumulation of the industrial waste, that remains exactly where it was generated. It's basically an economy engineered so that the local geography subsidizes the global profit.
Which brings us to the actual mechanism that makes this whole thing possible, which is the externality.
Yes, the externality, a classic economic term.
Right. And for anyone listening who didn't, major in economics, an externality is like, okay, imagine your neighbor is throwing a massive, highly profitable block party.
A really good party.
Right. They're charging entry, they're selling drinks, just making an absolute fortune.
Okay.
But you weren't invited, you don't get a cut of the door money, and yet you are the one who has to pay the noise complaint fines.
Oh, that's brutal.
And you're the one who has to wake up the next morning and clean up all the red plastic cups and the trampled landscaping in your own yard.
Yeah, that analogy captures the frustration of it perfectly.
It's infuriating.
It really is. In the context of industrial extraction, an externality is basically the cost of production that the producer manages to push off their own balance sheet.
And onto the public.
Exactly. It is the externality made physical, gains privatized, losses socialized.
Right.
But, to truly grasp how this export colony model operates in Alaska, we can't just look at it as some rogue corporate behavior.
Like it's not just an accident.
No, not at all. We have to look at the legal architecture, because this entire system was meticulously negotiated and legally designed.
Okay, I am assuming you're talking about the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act.
Yes, ANCSA.
Signed in 1971, right?
That's the one. ANCSA is really the foundational legal bedrock of modern Alaska. And to understand it, you have to understand the pressure cooker of 1971.
Set the scene for us.
So, oil had just been discovered at Prudhoe Bay. massive amounts of oil. But the oil companies couldn't build the Trans-Alaska Pipeline to get that oil out because the land rights were entirely unresolved.
Because indigenous Alaskans still had claims to the land?
Exactly. They had valid, unextinguished Aboriginal claims to the entire state. So the federal government needed a way to clear those claims and do it quickly to get the oil flowing.
So the government steps in to make a deal, but they don't do it the way they did in the lower 48, right? Like they don't create reservations.
Right. And this is the defining twist of RNCSA. The Act extinguished Aboriginal land claims in exchange for roughly 44 million acres of land and about $962.5 million.
Okay, a huge amount of land and money.
It is. But that land and money did not go to sovereign tribal governments.
Who did it go to?
Instead, the U.S. Congress mandated the creation of newly minted for-profit native regional and village corporations.
Wow. Okay, just think about the mechanics of that for a second.
It's massive.
You are taking indigenous land stewardship, which, for 10,000 years has been governed by community survival, seasonal balance, just take only what the ecosystem can replenish, and you are legally forcing it through a Wall Street filter.
A literal corporate mandate.
Yeah. Suddenly you have a corporate board of directors. You have shareholders who expect quarterly dividends. You have a legal fiduciary duty under state law to maximize profit from the land.
And this raises such an important question about agency within an export colony.
Right.
Because the native corporations, they own the land. But to generate those dividends that they are legally required to provide to their shareholders, they generally can't just, leave the land untouched.
They have to make money off it.
Right? And they must partner with massive outside capital to extract the resources because they don't have the billions of dollars required to build a mine or a drill rig themselves.
Makes sense.
So it inherently forces this profound compromise between traditional ecological stewardship and the demands of modern corporate capitalism.
I mean, that completely scrambles the usual simplistic narrative we hear about resource extraction.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not just some cartoon villain corporation swooping in to steal land. The local communities are the literal landowners. They are the shareholders. And they are the ones sitting at the negotiating table.
Right, they have a seat at the table.
But as we're about to see in our first story today, even when you own the land, the physical reality of that externality still ends up in your backyard.
It does.
So we are going to head about 90 miles north of Kotzebue, deep into the roadless Northwest Arctic, to a place called Red Dog.
Yeah, Red Dog. So just to set the scale here, Red Dog is the largest single source of zinc on the entire planet.
Wow, number one.
Number one. And it's also a major producer of lead. The deposit was confirmed back in the late 1960s, but they didn't actually begin production until 1989.
Okay.
And it is operated by Teck Resources, which is a massive multinational mining company. But, crucially, it operates on land owned by the NANA Regional Corporation.
And NANA is the Iñupiat-owned, for-profit Alaska Native Regional Corporation that we just described.
Exactly.
So they represent over 15,000 shareholders across the Northwest Arctic. So NANA owns the mineral rights, and they have an operating agreement with Teck Resources. And that agreement, it involves royalties paid directly to NANA and strict commitments to hiring local Iñupiat workers. So, again, NANA is not a passive victim here. They are the landlord.
Exactly the context we need. And yet, this brings us to one of the most stunning data points in the entire dossier we're looking at.
Yeah, I have to admit, when I first read the source material on this specific point, I had to read it like 3 times to make sure I wasn't hallucinating.
It's a shocking statistic.
It really is. So, despite being on indigenous-owned land, despite operating under modern environmental regulations, Red Dog perennially ranks as the #1 polluter on the Environmental Protection Agency's Toxics Release Inventory.
The TRI.
The TRI. #1 in the entire United States. We are talking about hundreds of millions of pounds of toxic releases reported year after year.
Yeah.
I mean, how is a mine in the pristine Arctic out-polluting, massive petrochemical refineries in Louisiana? Or the steel mills in the Rust Belt? It sounds like an absolute apocalyptic wasteland.
Right, and this is where we must rigorously separate how a federal bureaucracy defines a word from the actual mechanical ecological reality on the ground.
Okay, explain that.
So the EPA's toxics release inventory rules are an accounting mechanism, and they are incredibly rigid.
Right.
The EPA mandates that the mine must count the naturally occurring metals contained in the rock it digs up. Specifically, the waste rock and tailings that are left over after the valuable concentrate is extracted as a quote-unquote release into the environment.
Okay, let me see if I can translate this accounting logic because it's kind of wild.
Go for it.
It's like a strict fitness app that counts a daily, over-the-counter multivitamin pill as a massive 5,000-calorie cheat meal simply because the pill contains iron and the app categorizes all iron as heavy dietary intake.
That is a brilliant way to conceptualize the distortion. It really is. The rock they are digging out of the earth is naturally full of zinc and lead. That is the entire reason the mine was built there in the first place.
Right, they didn't put the zinc there?
Exactly. When Teck Resources digs up that metal-rich rock, crushes it, takes the concentrated zinc they actually want to sell, and then places the leftover rock back into heavily engineered, legally permitted storage facilities right there on the mine site.
The EPA's accounting rule forces them to categorize the trace metals still trapped inside that stored rock as a toxic release.
Yes.
So well over 99%, and the filings sometimes show up to 99.9% of that massive headline-grabbing toxic release tonnage is just this native metal-bearing rock that is being moved from a hole in the ground to a permitted pile above the ground on the exact same property.
Exactly.
It is not like liquid poison being actively pumped out of a pipe into a salmon stream.
Right. And it's highly misleading if a listener equates the regulatory word release with active, uncontained poisoning of the biosphere.
Which is what it sounds like.
It absolutely sounds like that. And Teck Resources obviously spends a lot of time publishing explainers to clarify this. But while we treat company materials as interested sources, even neutral environmental regulators acknowledge that the TRI definition creates a massive numerical distortion that terrifies the public unnecessarily.
Yeah, that makes sense. But, and I think this is a really crucial pivot, just because the EPA's #1 ranking is largely a bureaucratic illusion, that does not mean Red Dog operates without an ecological footprint.
Not at all.
The source material is very, very clear on this. There is a real physical externality occurring. It just isn't that stationary pile of waste rock.
Right. The genuine mechanical threat is fugitive dust. Metal-laden dust.
Okay, walk us through the mechanics of that, because Red Dog isn't just a pit in the ground. It's in the roadless Arctic.
Right.
So to get the zinc to the global market, they had to build their own custom infrastructure, right? The DeLong Mountain Transportation System?
Correct. It is a 52-mile private haul road connecting the inland mine to a specialized shallow water port on the Chukchi Sea. I want you to visualize this. Massive, specialized, heavy-duty trucks hauling pulverized zinc and lead concentrate along a 52-mile dirt and gravel road traversing the open Arctic tundra.
It's back and forth constantly.
Constantly. For years, as these trucks made their high-speed runs, the vibrations in the wind would cause fine, heavy metal-laden particulate dust to escape.
Just blowing right off the truck.
Exactly. It blew off the trucks during transit, it escaped during the complex loading and unloading operations at the port facilities, and it settled directly onto the surrounding tundra.
And the dossier details some really extensive environmental monitoring that was conducted by groups like Alaska Community Action on Toxics alongside state regulators.
Yes, very thorough studies.
And they found elevated levels of lead, zinc, and cadmium in the soils, the delicate tundra vegetation, and crucially, the snowpack near the haul road.
The snowpack is key.
Right. And here is where the mechanics of the ecosystem really take over. Because when spring comes, that snow melts. The cadmium and lead that was locked in the snowpack flushes directly into the Wulik River drainage.
And the Wulik River is not just some random line on a map.
No.
It is the primary drinking water source and a critical subsistence fishing river for the Iñupiat villages downstream.
Wow.
Specifically Kivalina, which is located right near the river mouth, and it's also utilized by the community of Noatak.
And this is where the abstract theory of the export colony crashes violently into the physical reality of the human body.
Yes.
Because the residents of Kivalina didn't necessarily hold a town hall and vote to have a 52-mile industrial haul road built upstream of their drinking water, but they are the ones looking at the water quality reports, worrying about the cadmium levels in the spring runoff.
They bear the psychological and physical burden.
Exactly. Although, to be entirely fair to the history documented in the sources, mitigation did happen.
It did.
When this dust issue became highly publicized in the 2000s and 2010s, Teck and the regulators implemented enclosed truck trailers, sealed shipping containers, and much stricter dust controls at the port. So the situation has quantifiably improved.
It has improved, yes, but the fundamental structural tension of the export colony remains entirely intact.
How so?
Well, The dust that still manages to drift off that road, however reduced it is today, is quite literally carrying someone else's profit, while the biological risk is borne entirely by the local watershed.
Yeah. So what does this all mean for a family actually living in the Northwest Arctic burrow?
Yeah.
Because you can't just look at red dog as a toxic threat. If you live there, you also have to look at it as the absolute foundation of your regional economy.
It is a profound, really agonizing trade-off.
Yeah.
Red Dog provides a massive percentage of the regional tax base. That tax money funds the local school district. The mine provides high-paying, specialized wage jobs in an incredibly remote region where wage jobs are just exceptionally scarce.
The economic engine.
It is. And through the nanocorporation dividends we discussed earlier, it provides direct, quarterly shareholder income to the Iñupiat families living in the exact same villages whose water is at risk.
It's the ultimate double-edged sword. For many families, the mine is simultaneously an environmental burden they have to constantly monitor and the vital paycheck that allows them to buy heating fuel to survive a sub-zero winter.
Right.
But, if we break down the corporate profit structure, the inequality of the export colony theory really crystallizes.
It becomes very stark.
Because the zinc concentrate sails out of the Chukchi seaport during the short, ice-free summer months. It goes to massive smelters in Asia and Canada.
Leaving the state entirely.
Right. So the vast majority of the revenue flows outward to Teck Resources' global shareholders. A much smaller portion flows to NANA locally. But the systemic costs, the dust, the ecological monitoring, the permanent scarring of the tundra, are borne 100% by the local geography.
And this raises an inevitable, terrifying question about the future.
Which is?
What happens to the mechanics of the system when the ore eventually runs out?
The forever maintenance.
Precisely, long-term stewardship. When Red Dog eventually shuts down, those environmental obligations do not just evaporate.
The rocks are still there.
The rocks are still there. The water treatment plants that currently prevent the heavy metals in the pit from leaching into the groundwater, those must operate in perpetuity.
Forever.
Forever. The management of those massive engineered impoundments of waste rock must be maintained. We are talking about obligations that extend for generations, possibly centuries.
And who truly pays for that?
Right. Is the financial bonding adequately funded to account for inflation over 200 years? Or does the global capital simply move on to the next extraction site in South America or Africa, leaving the local native corporation and the state of Alaska holding the bag for perpetual water treatment?
Yeah. That is the stationary cost of the export colony. The wealth leaves, the waste stays, and the maintenance bill stretches into infinity.
Exactly.
And, Red Dog shows us what happens when the waste is a physical mountain of rock. You can point to it, you can measure it, but what happens when the quote-unquote waste isn't something added to the environment, but something stolen from it?
That's the second half of our story.
Right. What happens when the externality swims? To answer that, we're going to travel 800 miles south, away from the zinc mine, to the massive river systems of the Yukon and the Kuskokwim.
Here, the export colony dynamic isn't about mining rocks. It is about a biological resource.
The salmon.
It is about the vanishing salmon and the cascading mechanics of what happens when an entire human food system basically collapses.
We are talking about Chinook salmon, which are also known as king salmon and chum salmon. These fish are the absolute lifeblood of the Yukon and Kuskokwim river communities.
They are the foundation of everything there.
But over the last decade, the runs have completely cratered. The Chinook runs began a steep decline in the early 2010s, and they just never recovered. And then in 2020 and 2021, the chum salmon, which are historically the abundant workhorse fish that fill the freezers in the smokehouses when the kings are scarce, they hit the absolute lowest levels ever recorded.
It was devastating.
The numbers didn't just dip, they fell below the minimum biological requirements for human survival.
And we really need to pause here and define what survival needs and subsistence actually mean in this context.
Yes, please.
Because for the Yupik, Cupik, and Athabaskan families living along these rivers, subsistence fishing is not a recreational activity.
I really want to emphasize this for you, the listener. This isn't about some guy in a $300 Orvis vest fly fishing on a weekend, being mildly annoyed that he has to practice catch and release.
Not at all.
Subsistence is the keystone of life in rural Alaska. It is absolute food security. In a village where there are no roads, where groceries have to be flown in on small bush planes, a gallon of milk or a basic cut of meat can cost an astronomical amount.
Unimaginable prices for most people.
Right. So catching, cutting, drying, and smoking salmon in the summer is literally how a family generates enough caloric value to survive the winter.
It is. And it is also the mechanical foundation of their culture.
How so?
The process at the fish camp, that is how elders teach children about biology, about weather, and discipline. It is the basis of the sharing networks that hold these villages together.
Right, sharing the catch.
Exactly. When a successful hunter or fisher brings in a large catch, it is distributed to the elders, to the widows, to those who are physically unable to fish for themselves. When the salmon disappear, the entire social safety net of the village doesn't just strain, it functionally breaks.
The tribal testimony in the dossier is just heartbreaking. They describe empty drying racks and completely silent smokehouses. Subsistence households are managing a devastating, multi-layered loss.
It's all happening at once.
Yeah, it is physical hunger, severe economic strain, and a spiritual crisis, all hitting at the exact same moment. And just to put a hard empirical number on the economic strain, the Tanana Chiefs Conference provided testimony estimating that on the Yukon River alone, the fishing closures cost the region roughly $27 million in direct income lost over about a 6-year period.
That is $27 million in foundational wealth essentially vanishing from some of the most economically vulnerable communities in the United States.
It's staggering.
And the severity of this collapse reached a historic bureaucratic inflection point just recently, actually, in April 2024.
Yeah, here's where it gets really interesting, and frankly, entirely unprecedented. The United States and Canada, acting through a bilateral organization called the Yukon River Panel, they signed an agreement regarding the Chinook famine.
They agreed to a complete, absolute suspension of directed Chinook fishing for a full 7-year salmon life cycle spanning from 2024 to 2030.
Let that sink in.
This isn't just closing the commercial fishery where people sell fish for money. It closes sport, domestic, personal use, and directed subsistence fishing.
All of it.
All of it. The only exception is in the highly unlikely event of a massive unforeseen abundance year. The goal is to force a rebuild of the run to a minimum target of 71,000 Canadian origin Chinook crossing the border.
Think about the magnitude of what that means mechanically. 2 sovereign nations looked at the biological data and essentially admitted that the food system had entirely collapsed.
They had to shut it down.
They shut it down for a whole generation of fish. They had to look. Indigenous families in the I families, whose ancestors have fished the Yukon since the Ice Age retreated, and tell them they are legally forbidden from targeting the primary source of their food.
It's almost hard to comprehend.
It really is. It is what ecological collapse looks like when it is finally codified into international law. But of course, this immediately brings up the most pressing, complex question for anyone listening. Let's play detective. What is actually killing the salmon? Where do they go?
And this is where the science gets incredibly complex, heavily contested, and deeply political.
Right.
We have to be scrupulously fair here, relying precisely on the scientific consensus in the source material. There are 3 main factors driving this collapse, and we need to break down the actual mechanics of each one.
Okay, let's start with the largest, most systemic factor: climate and the ocean.
So, the leading scientific consensus points to the Bering Sea as the primary driver of mortality. We are seeing unprecedented marine heat waves and a general, sustained warming of the ocean.
And how does that mechanically kill a salmon?
It completely shifts the marine food web. Young salmon entering the ocean rely heavily on specific types of zooplankton, particularly large, lipid-rich copepods.
Plankton. Okay.
Yes. These tiny organisms are essentially little packets of dense fat. But as the water warms, those large, fatty copepods vanish. They are replaced by smaller, lipid-poor zooplankton.
Oh, wow. Okay, so from the salmon's perspective, they swim out into the ocean expecting to eat a highly caloric steak, but the warming water means the buffet only has celery.
That is exactly it.
They might be eating constantly, but they aren't getting the dense fat reserves they actually need. It puts a massive nutritional squeeze on the fish before they even attempt to head back to the rivers to spawn.
Exactly. The ocean is basically becoming a harsher, nutritionally bankrupt environment for these fish.
Okay, that's factor 1. What's number 2?
Factor number 2 is disease. Researchers have found significantly elevated rates of parasites, specifically one called Ichthyophonus in the Yukon Chinook.
Ichthyophonus? What does that parasite actually do to the fish?
It attacks the internal organs, particularly the heart muscle.
Oh, man.
And if you think about it, the migration up the Yukon River is one of the most grueling biological marathons on Earth.
They have to swim hundreds of miles.
Thousands in some cases. And the fish stop eating when they enter fresh water. They rely entirely on the stored fat from the ocean, and their heart has to pump furiously against the river current.
Right.
So if your heart tissue is weakened and lesions are forming from a parasite, you simply run out of metabolic gas. The fish suffer massive organ failure and die in the river before they ever reach the spawning grounds.
So we have a warming ocean starving them of fat and a parasite attacking their hearts.
Yes.
Those are massive systemic environmental shifts. But it is the third factor that ignites the deepest anger, because it connects directly back to our theme of the export colony and the externality.
Right. Factor number 3, industrial bycatch.
Specifically, salmon intercepted by the Bering Sea pollock fishery.
To understand the tension here, we really must understand the scale of the trawlers. The Bering Sea pollock fishery is the largest fishery in the United States by volume.
It's massive.
It is a massive, highly capitalized industrial operation. These vessels are floating factories. The pollock they catch supplies global markets with surimi, which you might know as imitation crab, as well as fillets, and the fish sticks in your freezer.
The global supply chain at work.
Exactly. It is a cornerstone of the global seafood export economy.
Now, let's be totally fair here and present the industry side accurately, because this fleet is heavily regulated. It is one of the most rigorously observed fisheries on Earth, right?
It is.
They carry federal observers to monitor exactly what comes onto the decks. They utilize highly advanced genetic stock of origin analysis to figure out exactly where their catch comes from. How does that genetic tracking actually work mechanically?
So when a salmon is accidentally hauled up in the massive pollock nets, the federal observers take a tiny tissue sample, usually a fin clip. That DNA is then sequenced and cross-referenced against a massive genetic database of river systems. It allows scientists to say, with remarkable accuracy, this specific chum salmon caught in the middle of the Bering Sea was genetically destined to return to the Kuskokwim River.
That's incredible technology.
It is. And using this data, the pollock industry argues entirely correctly that the salmon they accidentally catch, the bycatch, is statistically a very small percentage of their enormous multi-million-ton overall pollock harvest.
Furthermore, fisheries scientists generally agree that even if the pollock trawlers reduced their salmon bycatch to absolute zero overnight, it would not be enough to miraculously rebuild the Yukon and Kuskokwim runs.
Right, because the starvation in the warming ocean is just so ecologically dominant.
But, and this is the absolute crux of the structural inequality we're talking about, when you are a family on the Yukon staring at an empty drying rack, the numbers from the pollock fleet do not feel like a statistical rounding error.
No, they don't.
Let's break down the real attributed figures from the source dossier, because the volatility is wild.
It really is wild.
In 2021, the pollock trawlers recorded catching approximately 546,000 chum salmon as bycatch. Over 500,000 fish intercepted and killed at sea.
500,000.
And genetic analysis shows a very meaningful share of those were bound for western Alaska rivers.
Yes. Then, in 2024, that number dropped dramatically to about 35,000 chum salmon.
Which is a huge drop. Why?
The industry implemented new avoidance measures, and overall chum abundance in the pollock fishing grounds was just lower. But then, in 2025, the bycatch numbers swung right back up to nearly 150,000 fish.
So the massive volatility proves that the bycatch isn't some steady, easily controlled dial that the captains can just turn down.
Right. It fluctuates wildly based on complex ocean conditions, water temperatures, and where the massive schools of pollock happen to be mixing with the salmon.
Unpredictable.
Highly unpredictable. But what really drives the point home about the power of regulation is what happened in September 2024.
Yes, the Central Gulf of Alaska closure. This is a vital mechanical data point on how the system operates. The North Pacific Fishery Management Council, or NPFMC, which regulates these federal fisheries, does have quote-unquote caps in place for certain species in certain areas.
And a cap is a hard regulatory limit. If the fleet catches that specific number of salmon accidentally, the regulators pull the emergency brake and the whole fishery gets shut down for the season.
Wow.
And in September 2024, 2 midwater pollock trawlers hit a Chinook hotspot near Kodiak Island. Within a matter of days, the fleet blew past the roughly 18,000 king salmon cap, hitting an estimated 19,665 fish.
And what happened?
The National Marine Fisheries Service actually pulled the trigger. They shut down the Central Gulf of Alaska pollock fishery early.
It was the first closure of its kind in the Gulf in at least 12 years. And the economic impact on the industrial fleet was massive. Roughly 110 million pounds of valuable pollock were left unharvested in the water.
It proves that caps do bite. When they are enforced, they have the power to stop the industrial machinery dead in its tracks to protect a biological resource. But think about the profound asymmetry here. The export colony theme is at an absolute boiling point.
Totally, because on one side of the equation, you have a highly capitalized billion-dollar commercial fleet operating out at sea, catching accidentally but legally tens of thousands of the exact same fish that an indigenous family sitting on the banks of the Yukon is legally forbidden to catch for their dinner table.
It is the externality made brutally, inescapably visible.
Yeah.
The corporate fleet views the bycatch as a regrettable, tightly managed, but ultimately acceptable incidental cost of doing business on a massive global scale.
It's just part of the spreadsheet.
Right, but the upriver communities view that exact same bycatch as the literal mechanical theft of their food security and their cultural inheritance.
It's the dump truck on the lawn. The pollock goes to global markets in Asia and Europe. The profit goes to the fishing corporations based in Seattle or Anchorage. And the cost, the dead salmon thrown overboard. The fish that never return to spawn, it stays in Alaska, carried entirely by the people who rely on the river.
Yes.
And this clash over who bears the cost came to a massive, highly publicized showdown very recently.
We are talking about the critical decision made on February 11th, 2026 by the North Pacific Fishery Management Council.
Right.
For years, tribal organizations across Western Alaska had been fighting fiercely for a hard cap on chum salmon bycatch in the Bering Sea, exactly like the cap that triggered the Gulf of Alaska closure.
They wanted a hard limit.
They wanted a firm ceiling that would automatically shut down the billion-dollar pollock fishery if they caught too many chum.
So the regulators have the vote. Do they install the hard cap to protect the rivers?
In an 8-3 vote, the council rejected the hard cap. They evaluated the mechanics of the fishery and decided that the potential economic devastation to the pollock fleet, the processing plants, and the global supply chain was just too high a risk to justify a hard shutdown mechanism.
But they didn't do nothing. The dossier outlines a highly technical compromise that they reached.
Correct. While they rejected the automatic shutdown of a hard cap, the council did approve the first ever Western Alaska chum bycatch limit.
Okay, so they set a limit. What was it?
They set the limit at 45,000 fish. Crucially, they tied this limit to a specific migration corridor closure. They designated a geographical area north of Iñupiat Pass and mandated its closure during the summer window from June 10th to August 31st. This rule is set to take effect in 2028.
Wait, explain the geography there. Why Iñupiat Pass specifically?
Iñupiat Pass is a narrow break in the Aleutian Island chain. It basically acts as a massive geographical funnel.
Oh, I see.
The salmon that have been feeding out in the deeper Pacific Ocean have to squeeze through that specific pass to enter the Bering Sea and begin heading toward the western Alaska rivers.
So they are all grouped up there.
Exactly. By closing the area immediately north of that bottleneck during the peak summer migration, the regulators are attempting to keep the massive pollock trawlers away from the highest concentration of returning chum salmon.
So on paper, it's a historic first. A specific numerical limit for Western Alaska chum and a geographical closure to physically separate the nets from the fish.
Right.
But if we evaluate this mechanically, does it actually provide enough protection to rebuild the ecosystem? Because the reactions in the source material are intensely polarized.
Very polarized.
Tribal organizations like Kawarak argue forcefully that a 75,000 limit falls absurdly short of what is necessary. They see it as a half measure that still allows 45,000 of the critical subsistence fish to be legally killed as industrial bycatch every single year.
And on the flip side, the pollock industry warns that even this 45,000 fish limit, combined with the Iñupiat Pass closure, risks causing severe economic and logistical harm to their operations.
How does it harm them?
They have to change how and where they fish, burning vastly more diesel fuel to travel to less efficient fishing grounds, losing processing time, and potentially leaving a massive amount of valuable pollock unharvested if they hit that limit.
Right.
What's fascinating here is how this 2026 fisheries decision perfectly mirrors the situation at the Red Dog Zinc mine. If we connect the two braided stories we've been telling, the structural parallels are undeniable.
They really are structurally identical.
Yeah.
At Red Dog, the externality is stationary. It is the physical, fugitive, metal-laden dust blowing off the haul trucks and settling into the snowmelt that feeds the Willik River.
Right.
In the Bering Sea, the externality is mobile. It is the incidental salmon bycatch, the tens of thousands of chum and chinook scooped up in the massive midwater trawls.
Both the toxic dust and the dead salmon are treated by the global export economy as rounding errors.
It's just a cost of doing business.
Exactly. They are considered the acceptable, unavoidable friction of industrial-scale extraction. The zinc mine has to operate to supply electronics, the trawlers have to fish to supply global protein, so a little localized dust and a few bycatch salmon are just the price of doing business.
But they're only considered acceptable because the people reaping the massive profits aren't the ones paying the physical price.
Bingo.
To the people living in Kivalina monitoring their drinking water, or the families along the Yukon River staring at an empty smokehouse, these aren't rounding errors on a spreadsheet. They are devastating, localized catastrophes.
It's immediate and personal.
It's contaminated drinking water. It's a closed fishing season that forces a family into poverty. It's the loss of a 10,000-year-old way of life.
And that brings us to the ultimate evaluation of the 2026 NPFMC decision.
Yeah.
By setting a 45,000 chum limit, the federal regulators are, for the very first time, attempting to force the massive export economy to internally account for a biological cost that has been externalizing for decades.
Right. They were putting a number on it.
They are finally putting a regulatory price on the salmon that the trawlers had previously been taking, essentially for free.
But I want to pose this directly to you, the listener. When you look at the mechanics of an economy fundamentally built to export wealth and warehouse the cost, does a 45,000 fish limit actually change the architecture of this system?
That's the real question.
Or does it just put a new, slightly more regulated price tag on the exact same externality? Does it stop the dump truck from backing up onto the lawn? Or does it just mandate that the truck can only dump 45,000 pounds of waste instead of 500,000 pounds?
That is the enduring structural question of the export colony.
Yeah.
Whether the land is owned by a native corporation trying to balance dividends and dust in the Northwest Arctic, or regulated by a federal council trying to balance billion-dollar trawlers and subsistence fishers in the Bering Sea, the through line remains stubbornly intact.
Wealth travels south.
The wealth travels south to distant markets, distant smelters, and distant shareholders. And the costs stay home. They stay in the sediment of the Woolwich River, and they stay on the empty drying racks of the people who depend on those resources.
You know, it's incredibly easy to distance ourselves from this. Alaska is vast, it's far away from most of us, and the sheer industrial scale of the extraction is just hard to wrap your head around.
It's massive.
But remember your own role in this global supply chain. We started by talking about the zinc in your electronics and the fish sticks in your freezer.
The stuff we buy every day.
Exactly. The zinc extracted from red dog is consumed globally. The pollock hauled out of the Bering Sea is consumed globally. If you use these products, you are, in some small but undeniable way, a beneficiary of this exact export colony dynamic. We all are.
We're part of the loop.
We get the pristine smartphone box, and we get the cheap, accessible protein at the grocery store, precisely because someone else, somewhere else, is absorbing the biological cost of the dust and the bycatch.
It is a profound realization, and it forces us to look critically at the invisible systems of production that sustain our modern convenience.
The systems we don't see.
Right. The legal frameworks like ANCSA, the corporate mandates, the regulatory definitions like the EPA's TRI accounting quirks or the fisheries bycatch limits. These aren't just dry bureaucratic details.
No.
They're the actual mechanical levers that decide who gets the profit and who gets the pollution.
I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over today, something that builds on the physical realities we've discussed. If the current global economic model relies entirely on the local environment, the Arctic tundra, the Bering Sea, the Yukon River, endlessly absorbing the costs of doing business for free, what happens to the entire global export machine when the river simply runs out of fish and the ecosystem goes biologically bankrupt?
That's a scary thought.
Can an export colony survive when there's literally nothing left to absorb the externality?
A system that continuously runs down its own biological and environmental capital eventually has to face the ledger.
The bill comes due.
The bill always comes due. The only remaining question is who will be forced to pay it.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the source material. I hope this exploration of red dog, the Bering Sea trawlers, and the mechanics of the export colony has given you a new lens through which to view the world. Keep questioning the true cost of the things we consume. Because somewhere, out there, the dump truck is still backing up onto the lawn. We'll get you next time.